March 1876, a cramped Boston boarding house. Two young men hunch over two ends of the same simple circuit. Metal soaks in acid, that's the battery. There's a little drum and connecting wire. The smell of smoke and metal fills the air. The professor is a klutz. He spills the battery and its acid is on him. He calls out, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." The assistant runs in. He had heard the professor over the other end of the circuit. They have just made the world's first telephone call. "Mama, Mama." The neighbour searched in vain for an abandoned baby. "Mama." The noise continued. Meanwhile, Melly and Alec hide around the corner, suppressing their laughter. There was no baby, only machinery and two very, very mischievous teenage boys, the sons of a famous professor. The professor had challenged Alec and Melly to build something that made the same noise as a human, and so they pored over his anatomy textbook in order to understand the voice box. They convinced the local butcher to chop up a lamb's head, and they even made impressions they took from the jaws of a human skull, although where they found that skull, nobody knows. Armed with their new knowledge, some scrap metal and a bit of wood, the boys worked in secrecy. They shaped a palette that came with teeth, a tongue, lips and a makeshift mouth. This is how those boys had got that device to say, "Mama, Mama." Years later, Alec recalled, "We quietly slipped into our house and closed the door, leaving our neighbour to pursue her fruitless quest for the baby. Our triumph and happiness were complete." Victorian Edinburgh in those days bombarded Alec and Melly with noise. Hooves on cobblestones, the newspaper boy, and of course the cries of the French expression "Garde l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water," but in Scottish mouths sounded much more like "Garde l'eau." From the kitchen pots clattered, and from the professor's office came something else entirely. "Pa, pa, pa, ma, ma, ma." The professor was a speech therapist, and it was in his study that he helped his young students to overcome their lisps and their stutters. So the boys' life was filled with sounds in exactly the same way their mother's was not. A childhood infection had left their mum, Eliza, deaf. In order to communicate with her, Alec had learnt to cast his voice deeply, and he spoke, if you can believe this, directly into her forehead. It was in this way that she could understand him, but not from the sounds he made, but rather from the vibrations. And so, from a very young age, because of his father's training and because of his own experience helping his mum, Alec developed a remarkable sense of tone and pitch, but he also developed a remarkable empathy for the deaf. After Alec and Melly came a third brother, Edward, and to put the professor in a place where he was most likely to succeed, the family moved from Edinburgh to London. This was a difficult period for Alec. He understood, on the one hand, his sense of duty towards his dominant and often domineering father, but on the other, driven by his own natural ambition, he wanted to carve a life out for himself, and this is something he had started to do. But Edward's health deteriorated, and this brought Alec back towards the parental home. Edward lost weight, he coughed, he struggled for breath. These were sure signs of tuberculosis, and they accumulated in Edward's inevitable passing in 1867 when he was only 18 years of age. The full weight of Eliza's concern now fell to Alec. She said,
"Young birds are very prone to try the strength of their wings too soon."
But this was not Victorian or Scots wisdom. After Edward's passing, this was the wisdom of overbearing, overprotective and anxious parents. Alec found himself back at the family home. It did, however, bring him back into contact with his Skye Terrier, Trove. Together with Trove, Alec pulled off another acoustic miracle. Foreshadowing the work of the behavioural psychologists of the next century, men like Skinner and Watson, Alec manipulated Trove's jaw and bribed him with treats. Now, using this manipulation and bribery, he managed to get the dog to make the following sounds: ow, ooh, ma, ga, and all of that culminated in Alec getting the dog to say, "How are you, grandmama?" So very soon, Alec got his first taste of fame. He and the dog Trove were the talk of London. But tuberculosis would not leave the family alone. The following year, Melly returned to Edinburgh with his new wife and their baby son, another Edward. But the baby was coughing and spluttering, and before he reached his second birthday, he was dead too. Not long after, Melly followed him. Eliza had now lost 2 sons and her only grandchild. Alec was burdened, not only with sorrow, but with the pressure he felt as the only remaining son. Skinny, scruffy, always exhausted, and, according to Eliza,
the perfect baby.
Alec's father made an extraordinary, and it turned out, fateful decision. He would move the whole family to Canada. Oh, Alec could not bear it. He was enjoying his time at university, he was enjoying teaching deaf children, and he was enjoying the companionship of a young woman, Marie Eccleston. His dad was now threatening to take him out of the world's best city, the world's most bustling city, a city in which a young man like Alec could carve his own path, and take him to where? The backwoods of a godforsaken colony? How could his father do this to him? Well, actually, he could do it to him, because the signs were there. Difficulty breathing, skinniness, constant headaches. Alec said later, "I went to Canada to die." Well, the plan proceeded. Except Alec did not die, and then 1 year later, in 1871, he escaped. He escaped his domineering father, he escaped his overprotective mother, he escaped the backwoods of Canada and found himself bathing in the most peculiar sound he'd ever heard. It was the sound of Bostonians speaking to each other. Free of stinking London and away from Canada, Alec got busy. In Boston, he would use his father's visible speech system and all the emerging ideas of the time, such as sign language, to do what he felt he was put on earth to do, to help young children who were speech impaired and, more importantly, deaf children like his mother had once been. It was this teaching work that soon brought Alec into contact with a man called Gardiner Hubbard. Hubbard was a well-to-do patent attorney and telegraph reformer. He enrolled his daughter Mabel into one of Alec's classes. Mabel stunned Alec at how well she navigated the speaking world. Alec, on the other hand, was not studying at all. Mabel later recalled, "I did and did not like him. On the one hand, he was so interesting that I was forced to listen to him. But he himself I disliked. He dressed carelessly and in a horribly shiny broadcloth which made his jet black hair look shiny. Altogether, I did not think of him a gentleman." She continued, "There was a lack of assurance in the habit he had of passing his hand over the thick high curls of his forehead." Mabel had spotted quickly that Alec put those around him at ease, but he himself was never at ease. Nevertheless, under Alec's tuition, Mabel mastered visible speech and she transformed her enunciation. Intellectual, like Alec, socially hyper-capable, unlike Alec, the teacher was ready and so the student had appeared. And then it happened, the Tea Party that changed the trajectory of the human race. Mr. Hubbard invited Alec over to his house in Boston. Alec once again proved his remarkable understanding of sound. Did the other guests know, he asked, that the strings of a piano repeated a note that was sung into them? He then lifted the lid of Hubbard's piano and in a deep, booming voice, in exactly the same way he had once sung into Eliza's forehead, Alec sang into the strings of the piano. And of course the strings vibrated and sang back. Mr. Hubbard, the telegraph reformer, and thorn in the side of William Orton's Western Union, asked Alec, "Do you know anything about the telegraph?" How funny that Mr. Hubbard should ask that. When Alec was stuck in Canada, he explained, he thought about a membrane, a little bit like the device he had created that could say, "Mama, Mama." This membrane, he said, could be used to translate sound into an electrical signal. Now at the time, men like Thomas Edison and Elisha Gray were trying to overcome the limitation of Morse's single-wire telegram. Alec, with his understanding of harmonies, thought that multiple waves could go down the same line but on different frequencies. And so yes, as a matter of fact, he told Mr. Hubbard, I know quite a lot about the telegraph. Hubbard, the entrepreneur and telegraph reformer, met not a school teacher that day, but a man he thought could change the world. They, of course, all called him Alec. But to differentiate himself from his father, he had chosen a new middle name. And of all the names he could have chosen, he chose the name Graham. And so that tea party gave birth to Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor, and dispatched Alec Bell, the son of a professor, to history. Alexander Graham Bell was, in many ways, a person of his time. Marooned in what he called the backwoods of Canada, he began thinking about the newly viral telegraph. How could he not? Then in Boston, Alex was unburdened by Scottish pessimism and unburdened by Canadian self-doubt. Once free of his overbearing parents, his mind wandered, and it wandered in a city alive with the Enlightenment ideals of human and social perfectibility, a city buzzing with the belief that to every problem there was a solution. These notions thrived in the drawing rooms of men like Hubbard, where invention, entrepreneurship and Enlightenment ideals collided like they had once collided in the drawing room of William Godwin. The big breakthrough for electromagnetism came with Volta and those frog's legs of his, which, for the first time in history, allowed humanity to create a continuous current within a circuit. A code of dots and dashes travelled down a single wire. But of course the simplicity became its problem. Operators could not send or receive more than one message at a time. So, one obvious, if expensive solution was to add more wires, like the proposed 26 wires that would connect London to Edinburgh. A better solution, of course, was to send multiple signals down the same piece of wire at the same time. This is what men like Gray and Thomas Edison were working on. And of course, this is what Hubbard had discussed with Alec at that fateful tea party. At the time, there was no thought at all of sending a voice down the wire. The challenge was sending multiple telegraph signals down the same line. This, of course, begs the question, why would Alexander Graham Bell be the man to do this? Well, if his childhood taught us anything, it was this. He was acoustically remarkable. His tone, the voices he could create, and the sounds he could process in those wonderful ears of his were exceptional. Sound was the foundation of his idea. He had the idea to send different harmonies along the same piece of wire. In that regard, of course, Alexander Graham Bell was perfectly qualified for the job. Unfortunately, just like Samuel Morse before him, Bell had no practical electrical skills whatsoever. And also like Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell was a little bit flaky. In Visionaries, Rebels and Machines, I actually describe him as a Scottish furball of indecision. I'm going to be honest now. Part of me regrets being so harsh. But it's true. He was insecure, conflict avoidant, and he was extremely indecisive. But how much of that came from years of internalised criticism from his parents? I think that's a fair question. His traits and his coping mechanisms may have helped him survive his childhood and may have helped him navigate that difficult relationship with his father, but they weren't much use in a world dominated by people like William Orton of Western Union. So what had got Alexander Graham Bell through his childhood, I don't think prepared him for the task ahead. That must have been on his mind. So this serious question hung over Alexander Graham Bell. Could he be the man to do this? Could he, for example, develop the technical skills? Did he then have the tenacity to push the work forward? And finally, if he succeeded, did he have the skills to deal with people like Orton and, of course, Gardiner Hubbard? After the Tea Party, Hubbard and Bell, they went on to reach a business agreement. Historians now talk about that moment as if a teacher walked into the room and an inventor walked out. It's a decisive scene, and if you make a movie about Alexander Graham Bell, that tea party would really matter. However, the truth is not exactly as clean-cut as that. Knowing what we know about Alec's character, what came next was hardly surprising. He simply bumbled along. Hubbard later called his work a great disappointment, a sore trial, saying, "I have been sorry to see how little interest you seem to take in telegraph matters." Alec had kept teaching all the time he was developing the harmonic telegraph. He kept using his father's visible speech system and he developed it further. So remarkably, even though he'd entered into business agreements with Hubbard, he continued to work as a teacher. And of course, eventually Hubbard's patience snapped. Alec had to give up his dream of helping children with lisps and stutters. He had to give up his dream of helping deaf children to navigate in a hearing world, or two things would happen. The first thing would be that Hubbard would dissolve their business partnership. And if the business partnership was dissolved, so too would Alec's engagement to his daughter, Mabel. What? Did you just hear me correctly? Yes, you did hear me correctly. Even though Mabel was only 15 when she met Alec, he was 26, they had developed, in that 1 year after the tea party, romantic feelings for each other. When he eventually proposed, she was 17 years of age. And so that year between the tea party and Hubbard's ultimatum coming was complete torment for Alec. He tried to juggle his work as a teacher and his work as an inventor, and of course he was overcome by strong feelings for Mabel. So Alexander Graham Bell felt like his world was falling apart. He thought himself no good and as an inventor, and obviously, looking back in history, it seems to me like he'd swapped one domineering figure, his father, for another, his soon-to-be, if the wedding went ahead, father-in-law. Things got worse for Alec. He did continue to work on a system that sent multiple signals down the same telegraph wire. But by the time he had something that was patentable, he'd been beaten to the punch. Elisha Gray and Thomas Edison had already submitted patent applications. Hubbard at this point could contain his frustrations no longer. Alexander Graham Bell's experience mirrored that of Samuel Morse. It took Morse years to go from the idea he had on the deck of the Sully to a working prototype. The painter in him, Finlay Morse, died hard, and the inventor, Samuel Morse, struggled to come out of the chrysalis that had formed around his previous self. Well, it was exactly the same with Alec. He didn't really do any serious work on the telegraph. And even though he'd entered into that business arrangement with Hubbard, not much changed for the following 12 to 18 months. That is when the ultimatum came. The engagement to my daughter will be cancelled, and you, young man, will never darken this doorstep again. The crisis had arrived. This was the real moment of transformation. This was the moment Alec was forced to let go, not just of his father's visible speech system, but of his whole dream, his very purpose, to help deaf children like Mabel, like his mother from years before. Only once that ultimatum came and this genuine transformation arrived, did the fun and games really begin. Well, Mr. Hubbard, your challenge is accepted. This was the beginning of the end of Alexander Graham Bell's obsession with visible speech and the beginning of a new obsession with the telegraph. Now, Alec had, of course, been thinking about the telegraph for some time, but he was lacking the practical skills to bring it to life. That was, of course, until Hubbard made good on his promise to introduce him to a practical set of hands. Those practical hands belonged to a man called Thomas Watson. Over on Court Street in Boston, there was an engineering firm led by a certain Mr. Charles Williams. And of course, the shop manufactured things like sounders and relays, all of the things that the inventors of the day needed. Thomas Edison was one of his customers. Thomas Edison, however, was the exception and not the norm. The exception because he actually knew what he was doing and would become a successful inventor. Most inventors of the day were actually crackpots. Mr. Williams' firm really was one of the best, and his star machinist was a certain Thomas Watson. Now, Watson worked out the back in the workshop, and Mr. Williams fronted the shop dealing with customer inquiries and, of course, customer complaints. Except, of course, one day, a stranger came flying from the front office, and he arrived right at Watson's workstations. Watson said later he was a slender, quick-moving man, but his face was pale. Alex seemingly was still not looking after himself. The perfect baby, as his mum had said. Alec had with him two instruments. Watson had made them, but he'd not made them to the exact specifications that Alec needed. What were these two things? Well, these were the devices for sending and receiving multiple signals down the same telegraph wire. Where did this all start? Where did this idea come from? Well, back in Brantford in Canada, Alec read the work of a man called Helmholtz. The book was called On the Sensation of Tone. Helmholtz had managed to synthesize the vowel sounds A, E, I, O, U by keeping tuning forks in simultaneous but constant vibration. Of course, what that meant was Helmholtz's vowels had been created not by a human but by machinery. I think this sounds very much like the machinery Alec created back in Edinburgh, the machine that could say mama, and it wasn't completely different from the sounds that he got his Skye Terrier to make. So this was the moment of insight. Alec thought different vibrations from the devices he handed back to Watson could send 6 or even 8 telegraph messages over the same piece of wire at the same time. Watson started to think maybe Alexander Graham Bell wasn't another crackpot, but maybe he was a serious inventor exactly like Thomas Edison was. Very soon he was working exclusively with Alec on the harmonic telegraph. So Alec had found his practical right-hand man, but he'd also found somebody who could deal and filter his unlimited imagination. Of the imagination, Thomas Watson said the following: his head seemed to be a teeming beehive at which he would often let loose one of his favourite bees for my inspection. A dozen young and energetic workmen would have been needed to mechanise all of these buzzing ideas. So Alexander Graham Bell had more ideas than all the engineers in the world could probably deal with. In 1875, though, one of those buzzing ideas that had started in Brentford began to change. If waves were going down the wire, and that doll back in Edinburgh could say mama, and the dog Trove could say, how are you, grandmama, and Helmholtz could get those tuning forks to make the vowel sounds, the A and the E and the I or the U, why on earth couldn't a sound be transformed into an electrical signal at one end of a circuit and made to speak at the other? This idea took a hold of Alexander Graham Bell's mind, and it was one of the bees that, once released from his imagination, Thomas Watson thought was worth pursuing. Of course, as the idea for the harmonic telegraph continued and deepened, so too did Alexander Graham Bell's love of Mabel. This, of course, placed the poor girl in the unfortunate position of being stuck between her father, the capitalist, and of course her fiancé, the inventor. With that being said, she started to get used to this idea and all of a sudden was presented with her first task. She needed to convince Alec to submit a patent for the transmission of the human voice. He would have to do this if Hubbard was going to get any of his money back, because the race for the system to send multiple signals down the telegraph had already been lost. Gray and Edison had submitted their patents, and Edison would eventually win with the invention of the quadruplex telegraph. Alec agreed to do this. Of course, he agreed to do it in his own way, which is to say he would do it slowly, if ever. Hubbard had, of course, lost faith in his future son-in-law's ability to do anything that looked like paperwork. So instead, he gathered all of Alexander's notes, and in February 1876, without discussing it with Alec, he submitted a half-baked patent application. The day he submitted it, bearing in mind that all of this really started because of the love affair with Mabel, was symbolic. It was Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 1876. Now, once the application had gone in, all Bell and Watson then had to do was build the damn machine, because actually it did not work. The patent was a theoretical patent, so it looked good on paper, but of course, in order for the patent to be granted and then later exploited, the system actually have to work. Now, the patent included their ideas, and their ideas were simple. They thought a circuit could be used to change sound into an electrical signal, and they thought some sort of speaker, a bit like Alex's talking mama doll, could then make a sound at the other end. But of course, they had not yet proved this, and that is why Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson now needed to get busy. And of course, they had to get busy because on the 3rd of March, 1876, the Patent Office granted it, patent number 174465. Now, originally, Alec was furious with Hubbard, but of course, the patent approval had proved his fiance's father and their teamwork correct. The submission was, of course, the right thing to do, not least because it had been granted. So, of course, Alec proudly presented the certificate to Mabel, and it was then hung in her house where that fateful tea party had occurred. Bell and Watson, with nowhere near the resources of Western Union, had won the patent race. All they now had to do was transmit a clear message. With funds running out and a need for secrecy, depending on which history book you read, they moved into Alec's lodgings in Exeter Place in Boston. Alex suspected a different kind of battery was required. On the other hand, Watson thought they needed a better transmitter. In the end, this is what they came up with. A diaphragm, like a small drum, had a needle on the end of it hung by a piece of thread. The needle went into some electrified solution. When you spoke into the diaphragm, exactly like I'm speaking into this microphone now, the needle moved ever so slightly and therefore changed the resistance of the circuit. So, as Thomas Watson spoke into the diaphragm, the resistance of the circuit changed and thus created a unique electrical signal that was mapped or fully analogous to the sound wave that went in. On the other end, their so-called speaker reversed the process and thus changed the unique electrical signal back into a sound wave. On March the 10th, 1876, 7 days after the patent was granted, Thomas Watson and Alexander Graham Bell set up the receiver in Alec's bedroom. The transmitter was, of course, in the next door room, and that's when it happened. Alexander Graham Bell knocked over the battery and spilled the acid on himself. That's when he cried out loudly, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Thomas Watson would later recall the following. "I rushed down the hall into his room and found he had upset the acid of a battery over his clothes. He forgot the accident in his joy over the success of the new transmitter when I told him how plainly I had heard his words. His shout for help on that night doesn't make a prettier story as did the first sentence, 'What hath God wrought?' which Moore sent over the telegraph 30 years before. But it was an emergency call, therefore typical of the great service the telephone was to render to mankind." The evening continued. They laughed over the telephone line, they tested it further. Alexander Graham Bell, of course, in his booming baritone, sang a version of God Save the Queen, and as the sun came up, he even danced the war dance that he'd been taught by the Iroquois back in Canada. So Mr. Watson was entertained by whoops and stamping, and oh my goodness were they moving. Not only did they have the patent, but they now had a working device. Mabel, of course, understood the significance of this technical breakthrough, and so too did her father, Gardiner Hubbard. Mabel wrote to Alec and said, "How can I tell you how very glad I am for you? I am so glad you have at last obtained this patent for which you worked so hard and have now, as you say, a fair prospect of success. I am just as happy as can be." Well, of course she was happy, because finally maybe she would be allowed to marry Alexander Graham Bell and they could get on with their lives. Mabel's faith in her fiancé had been rewarded. Mr. Hubbard, of course, now had a new headache. The harmonic telegraph, or the telephone as it would of course one day become known, needed to be scaled. And for that he needed money, and he didn't have any left. The telegraph had an issue in the sense that you could only send one message down the line, but Edison's quadruplex telegraph eventually fixed that. The telephone, on the other hand, had serious limitations. It didn't work over very long distances, and of course it only went in one direction. Don't forget the speaker was in one room and the transmitter was in the other. So Alec and the team had to get the telephone to work bidirectionally. They had to get it to work over longer distances. And for all of that work, they needed money. So off they went, giving demonstrations as they tried to entice investors to put their capital into their company. They immediately faced the same problems that Samuel Morse had faced. Those witnessing the demonstrations thought the telephone was some sort of parlour trick. They did not trust the telephone, and the ones who did trust it didn't really think it could be scaled to the same degree that the telegraph had already been scaled. But soon a new opportunity arose. The Declaration of Independence had been signed exactly 100 years earlier in the great city of Philadelphia. To celebrate, as the nation attempted to heal the wounds of the Civil War, the Philadelphia exhibition, spreading over 285 acres of fairground, containing 7 exhibition buildings, and kicked off with a new piece of music composed by Richard Wagner for President Ulysses S. Grant, would showcase America's exciting new scientific advancements. At the exhibition, Grant hosted Emperor Pedro II from Brazil, who, in America, preferred to be called Dom Pedro. He was on the committee for the Electrical Awards, and, if you can believe it, happened to have a soft spot for Alec. A couple of weeks earlier, Dom Pedro visited Alec's Boston School for the Deaf. You might be thinking, well, Alexander Graham Bell was surely honoured by such a visit. He was in fact annoyed. Dom Pedro had got it in his way of teaching, which, if you can believe this, he'd continued to do all throughout the development of the harmonic telegraph. You now see why Gardiner Hubbard was so infuriated by his soon-to-be son-in-law. Dom Pedro was not alone at the Philadelphia exhibition. Gardiner Hubbard was there as well, and he saw what a wonderful opportunity it would be for him and Alec. So he telegraphed Alec and told him to come immediately to Philadelphia. And of course Alec repeatedly and persistently ignored every telegraph from Gardiner Hubbard. Hubbard changed tack, and he now started to pester poor Mabel, placing her once again in between the inventor, her fiancé, and the capitalist, her father. Well, what did poor Mabel do? She popped on a hat, grabbed her coat, and she called for the carriage. She said to the coachman, "Right, off we go. We're going to Alec's, please." She asked Alec to stop marking papers and come with me, your wonderful fiancé, on a nice carriage ride. What he hadn't noticed is that Mabel had packed a small suitcase, and before they knew it, before Alec knew it, the carriage was all of a sudden at the railway station, where she handed him the suitcase, a train ticket, and she told him, "Off you go, Alec, you're going to Philadelphia." Now, of course, he protested. He refused to get on the train. And then Mabel did something, well, this is what she did. She switched on the tears, or at least this is how the legend goes, and she told him, "I think you might do this just to please me. If you won't do a little thing like this now, I won't marry you." Alexander Graham Bell once again hung under the threat of the dissolution of the engagement. But this time it didn't come from Gardiner Hubbard, it came from Mabel herself. This, in a way, was their relationship in a nutshell. Mabel, one way or another, moved and motivated the immovable and unmotivated Scott. He, of course, wrote a petulant letter from Philadelphia, but by the time it arrived in Boston, he was already having a wonderful time. In Philadelphia, the soft spot of Dom Pedro for Alexander Graham Bell mattered. He came over to see the telephone and to listen to a voice being transmitted. "Ce n'est possible," he exclaimed. "That's not possible." And later, "This thing speaks." Not fully understanding the technology, Dom Pedro then asked Alec, "Does it speak Portuguese as well?" The Emperor dragged over Sir William Thompson and the other judges from the Electrical Awards Committee. For over an hour, they took turns experimenting with the machine, and they tried to discover any trickery. But, of course, there was none to be found. Awarding him the gold medal for electrical equipment, the judges later wrote that Alec's telephone was the greatest marvel hitherto achieved with the telegraph. Then, with a knock on the door, it got better. Elisha Gray had come over to congratulate Alec on a race well run. He had beaten him to the punch and invented and created and demonstrated the harmonic telegraph. Elisha Gray couldn't have been any happier for Alexander Graham Bell. Not long after, Western Union's engineers told William Wharton that the telephone is inherently of no value to us. The future, they said, was in telegraphy. Alexander Graham Bell's victory was complete. He'd been congratulated by Elisha Gray, he'd won the gold medal, he'd won Mabel's heart, and of course he did eventually marry her, exactly like he had just married acoustics to electromagnetism inside of his telephone. 1 year later, Hubbard and Alec founded the Bell Telephone Company, through which, without any competition from Western Union, they could exploit the patent and the monopoly position it granted them. This is why patent 174465 was once described as the most valuable patent in history. And so we are at the end of our story. Alexander Graham Bell, with patent 174465, reached the pinnacle of his success. But within the story we learnt so much more. First of all, that a conceptual genius like Bell had to be matched with a practical set of hands. Of course, all the best managers and leaders will tell you this. The best teams are cross-functional teams, multidisciplinary teams. But we've had a peek, haven't we, again at how the computer works. With Samuel Morse we saw a code of dots and dashes. That's to say, we saw a digital and binary technology. But in this episode, we saw something else entirely, right? An analog technology. And the word analog itself comes because one signal is analogous to another. And that's how the harmonic telegraph worked. The electrical signal was analogous to the sound wave that went into the diaphragm. We also met, but not for the first time, a world-changing technology. Mr. Watson mentioned the telegraph, but the telegraph itself was built around the battery. Now with the telephone we see the third big technology of this series, and it of course evolved directly from the telegraph. Where does that leave us? Well, surely it leaves us with a warm, fuzzy feeling about a boy who overcame his childhood difficulties, escaped his anxious and domineering parents, and rose to prominence in America. In Boston, he fell in love. Invented a technology, but in doing so defeated the enemies that were closing in all around him. Edison, William Orton, Western Union. Alexander Graham Bell dispatched them all in what is genuinely an unbelievable story. And it's unbelievable because it's not true. Do you honestly believe that Alexander Graham Bell could beat Elisha Gray in a race to invent the harmonic telegraph? As we say in my hometown of Hull, no fucking way. No way could Alexander Graham Bell beat Elisha Gray, a skilled electrical engineer. Something else had happened. The invention of the telephone is a story that comes in two parts. The second part, hidden from history by a powerful corporate PR machine, is full of deceit and deception and skullduggery. It is to that second part that we turn to next when we conclude the story of Alexander Graham Bell, Elisha Gray and the telephone.